Support comes from the Janice Hawkins Cultural Arts Park on the main campus of Troy University, featuring the International Arts Center, the Fred Nall Hollis Museum, and the Huabaoju Gallery. More information at troy.edu/artspark.
From Troy Public Radio and Troy University, in partnership with the Alabama World Affairs Council, this is Speaking Globally, and I'm Walter Gavan. Welcome back to Speaking Globally, where we look at the history, politics, and culture of different regions and countries around the world and talk with people who can provide context and insight into some of the most important global issues we face. This is part 2 of our series on North Korea and the news of North Korean troops joining Russia in its war in Ukraine. The news brought fresh scrutiny to North Korea itself and the threat an alliance of so-called dissatisfied states like North Korea and Russia poses to the global world order. How real is this threat, and what are the implications for U.S. policy toward North Korea? We are fortunate to have one of the world's foremost Korea experts to answer these questions and more. Dr. Daniel Pinkston is a lecturer of international relations at Troy University and previously served as Northeast Asia Deputy Project Director for the International Crisis Group. He joins us today from Seoul, South Korea.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's interesting that North Korea commands as much attention as it does, considering its size and a population of about 25 million, which is half that of South Korea. Nuclear weapons, a huge standing army, and threats to use them will get you a lot of attention, won't it?
Yeah, that's correct. I think North Korea is a dissatisfied state. If you're familiar with, or North Korea watchers who follow it over time and have looked at the orientation of the regime, I would say it's a dissatisfied revisionist state. It's dissatisfied with the status quo. There are a number of internal problems because of poor governance, policy decisions, how they run their economy, their agricultural sector, and all of that. They have a lot of economic difficulties. They allocate a tremendous amount of resources to the military and to internal security. It's a very repressive society, repressive state. So, if you look at a basic trade-off, guns versus butter, for anybody who studied macroeconomics, there's less butter and more guns is the decision that the authorities have made over decades. So it's this distorted economy and society that is very militarized in the shadow of this economic deprivation. People wonder why there's not a bottom-up uprising, and it's very difficult to take collective action. And then the regime blames the external sources for their difficulties. So if there's any food insecurity or economic problems, economic stagnation, that's blamed on the West and the Americans and sanctions and the Japanese imperialists and the South Koreans and so forth. So there's always a scapegoat. And so from this position of dissatisfaction, they are strongly revisionist and wish to seek the overturn of global governance, the current liberal global governance based on post-World War II world order.
Traditionally, we have used diplomatic isolation, economic pressure, and military deterrence to deal with North Korea, while they have used saber rattling, military buildups, weapons development, and support of other bad actors to get our attention. What is different about the current situation? Does it require a different approach?
I think that's pretty much the default position. So many people are dissatisfied with North Korea's behavior. Many people are dissatisfied with North Korea's weapons development and the threats that North Korea poses. But absent using force and disarming North Korea by force, I think those are pretty much the default positions. So another thing I think we have to consider is North Korea's and the leadership's acceptance of risk and how far they're willing to go to seek the overturn or undermining of global governance. So I think we've been in World War III now for about 10 years. People talk about Cold War II or a new Cold War. I think from about 2014, we've been in this kind of hybrid world war. It's not like a really hot, intense war like World War I or World War II, but the objectives are similar. There's a group of dissatisfied states that really wish to overturn the order. So the World War II, post World War II liberal order was based on the peaceful settlement of disputes, the protection of human rights, open economies with free, fair trade and investment rules, the rule of law, and of course the institutions to support that order. But in an authoritarian order, and authoritarian regimes feel constrained by that and don't wish to play by those rules. So, as far as the peaceful settlement of disputes from the strongmen actors, for them and how they rise in their authoritarian systems, they use force. Force is a legitimate political instrument domestically and, in their view, also internationally. So, to settle any territorial disputes, military force is completely legitimate. So, we've seen that in action since 2022 with Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And now we see North Korea participating in that or sending military forces to the Russian Federation. And reports just in the past few days are that the North Korean military forces have engaged with Ukrainian military there. And also, I use this acronym CRINK. I've seen this floating around the internet, these dissatisfied powers. So the acronym CRINK, C is China, R is Russia, I is Iran, and NK is North Korea. So these are the four usual suspects, these dissatisfied powers. And they do have some collective action problems. Their interests do converge in some places, but they do diverge. They're very transactional, short-term oriented. But where they agree is they would like to see this Western-led world order and the position of the U.S. Undermined or replaced. And as far as any type of new system of governance, they're a little bit more murky on that. So Russia's trying to build, this grouping of states under the BRICS. They also have, security arrangement. China's doing the same, establishing, the BRI, Asian Investment Development Bank, AIIB, or whatever it is called, Shanghai Cooperation Organization for Security. So establishing these new organizations or institutions, but they have different visions of what the world should look like. But they certainly agree in that they want to rewrite the rules whereby, human rights don't matter. That's a sovereignty issue. They should not be questioned on the protection of civil liberties and civil rights and human rights internally. Peaceful settlement of disputes, they don't feel they should be constrained by that. So use of military force is legitimate, whether that's reuniting with Taiwan or reestablishing the Soviet empire. And I think people are mistaken. If Putin is appeased and in Ukraine, I don't think he will stop there. I think the orientation of that type of regime is to continue. I think Moldova, the Baltics, maybe Poland could be in his gun sights next. And certainly, China is looking at the Taiwan situation. And then also here in the Korean Peninsula. So at the party meeting in December of last year, Kim announced that he's giving up on Korean unification and named the Republic of Korea, South Korea, as an enemy state or hostile state. And one way to eliminate a hostile state or the enemy is to destroy them. So I think military force is back on the table for Kim. It can't be ruled out. The good news is that Kim is rational. He wants to survive. They really understand military force, and the only way to contain them is through military strength and deterrence.
You've written about what North Korea has learned from Russia's invasion of Ukraine and how closely they have been watching it. Now they're even participating in it as well as supplying weapons. Is this kind of out of theater operation unprecedented for them?
They have provided pilots and some other assistance in Vietnam, Syria, in Yom Kippur War back in '73 to Egypt, but this was quite limited. I don't think it was anything on this scale. And of course, war has changed since then. The technology has changed, and it's changing very rapidly. So everyone is watching and learning what's going on in Ukraine. And I think there are developments with, of course, with drones, electronic warfare, multi-domain warfare across space, cyber, and air, and then unmanned, vehicles, whether on the ground, air, also underwater vehicles. These things will apply to that domain as well. So they're watching this. The Russians are innovating. So this is a kind of cat and mouse game. So initially, for example, and I've been following this super closely, like some of the other military specialists are, but even a casual reading, it's clear that in the early days, the targeting, the weapon systems, equipment and information intelligence that the West was providing Ukraine, the HIMARS system, and then drones, strike drones, like the short-range switchblade drones for out in the field for tactical use, those types of things were very effective, as I recall, in the early days of the war, striking Russian positions. But then the Russians were able to innovate, and their electronic warfare capabilities were able to jam the guidance systems and the targeting systems of these strike capabilities. But then I was just reading this week that over the past week or two, the U.S. has developed these electronic warfare capabilities that are able to circumvent those jamming capabilities of the Russians. So they're able to get through those defenses again. So this, in the area of electronic warfare, I think this is where a lot of the innovation is in unmanned systems. So in a time of war, of course, the incentives are to innovate very quickly. So that's changing very quickly. I think the North Koreans are learning from that. They're seeing it in action with their own eyes out in the field in Ukraine or Kursk. And I think this is one area that maybe people are missing because, of course, it's been in the news or international news over this past year, the past 6 months or so. North Korea has periodically been engaged in these trash balloon campaigns, launching hundreds of these balloons into the south full of garbage and manure and so forth. So a lot of people were kind of struck by this. They thought it was irrational. What was North Korea doing this for? This was stupid, or this was for spite. But of course, in the South, the authorities had to respond to that. So the first responders, police, fire, military units had to go out to these areas and, of course, had to track the balloons, had to find out what was in them. They could have some, biological agents or some other kind of dangerous materials. So, of course, they had to take it seriously. But I think the North Koreans, of course, had a purpose for this. And it was interesting to note that when they did these initial campaigns, there was a large GPS jamming campaign, electronic warfare campaign that was coordinated at the same time. And this also happened this week as well. So launching these balloons, of course, that's done with the knowledge and authorization of the highest authorities in North Korea. It's not like some civil society group or club could just go out and launch these kinds of balloons. And then, of course, when those balloons were launched, it gives the North Koreans an opportunity to collect on the South Korean capabilities. So they can monitor the air defense of South Korea, South Korea's ability to track these devices or these balloons. And then, of course, where they land, they can follow the trajectory of these balloons. So if they really wanted to use balloons for a weapons delivery, such as bioweapons or something like that, they can have data from that. And then, of course, the response on the ground. So they can monitor the command and control and the communications of those interagency responses. So I would think they would be monitoring the police, fire, military responses, see how they coordinate the response to these balloons landing here. And then, of course, they could test the electronic warfare, the jamming, the GPS jamming that we've been picking up here in the South, and also do some analysis of the South Korean capabilities and responses to these balloons. And the Russians have been making these advances in electronic warfare. They're some of the best in the world, or maybe the world champions of electronic warfare. And this is an area that they can provide assistance to the North Koreans, or the North Koreans can test those systems here. And that poses a danger. And a lot of people don't see that because it's an intangible thing. We see a missile launch, of course, but electronic warfare, it's invisible to the eye for the most part, but it's very critical in modern day warfare.
Absolutely. And following up on the Russia relationship, in June, Russian President Vladimir Putin made his first trip to North Korea in over 2 decades. Is the relationship entering a new phase, or is it simply a transactional marriage of convenience based on mutual interest?
Very good question. I think it's mostly transactional. Where their interests converge, as I said earlier, this grievance against the West, the so called West. So if you read what Putin has said about that, he had that famous or notorious 5,000 word screed, before the invasion of Ukraine, about how Ukraine's not a real country and it's really part of Russia. And he's made it clear on several other occasions, both in written or spoken responses, about the kind of victimhood of Russia and how the collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. And, NATO and the EU, all of those liberal institutions of the post World War II order, whether it's in international finance, investment, security, trade rules, and all of those things. He believes it's oriented against Russia and that this should be dismantled. The primacy of the US dollar enables the US to impose financial sanctions and economic sanctions against countries for their belligerent behavior. So, this is one area where, of course, North Korea, Russia, Iran, and China have an incentive to cooperate, to undermine the position of the dollar, and to find ways to conduct trade and investment through other channels and mechanisms, through other clearing systems, cryptocurrencies, and so forth. And this is a way to avoid sanctions. This is why North Korea has been hacking or stealing cryptocurrencies, and then money laundering through these Russian mixers or clearing houses, which are able to operate inside Russia. So in those types of systems or financial transaction systems, a lot of dirty money is laundered through there, whether it's narcotics traffickers or smuggling and other illegal activities, weapons smuggling, and so forth. So these are areas where they wish to cooperate. In other ways, I mean, if you look and take a kind of David Ricardo comparative advantage orientation, a very liberal economic perspective on this, They are two natural trading partners in many ways. So the Russian Far East is land rich, labor scarce, a lot of resources. And this is an area where they could cooperate. Officials from the Russian Far East and economic advisors and authorities have also visited and accompanied Putin on that trip to North Korea. So, North Korean loggers, laborers have been working in the Russian Far East for some time now. That was an area of sanctions under the UN sanctions for North Korea's nuclear activities. They were supposed to have been repatriated or sent home because this is a source of hard currency for the regime, which enables North Korea to sustain its weapons programs. But any cooperation in the UN Security Council now has been thwarted. Basically, the sanctions regime is dead. So Russia and China, for the most part, are not going to enforce the sanctions that are on the books and are not going to support any new sanctions, considering the current geopolitical situation. So there are these other areas of cooperation, economic cooperation, sending laborers to the Russian Far East, the weapons that North Korea has provided, artillery shells, and now these military personnel. Russia can provide fuel, which is a scarce commodity in North Korea, food. North Korea faces chronic food insecurity. But for Russia, the grain and fuel as a lifeline to North Korea is a kind of a drop in the bucket. It's not a huge burden for them. And they can cooperate in other areas, these kind of gray zone areas, to continue this, what I call this hybrid war, hybrid World War III of crink against the West. So if that's breaking up NATO, breaking up the EU, breaking up all of the other liberal institutions, and create some other space or alternative world for these authoritarian regimes, that's the agenda.
As we just discussed, any talk of North Korea's supporters inevitably leads to a conversation about China. And China's intervention in support of North Korea during the Korean War prevented the reunification of the peninsula and resulted in the stalemate that led to the ceasefire. China has always been a key supporter, but that relationship has been fraught with tension as well, and especially lately. Recent developments would indicate that China isn't very happy with North Korea's increasing closeness to Russia and its elevated hostility to South Korea and Japan. How does China view North Korea these days?
That's right. And that's another thing that most people don't understand. I think there's always been an underlying tension between the two, even going back to the East Asian world order that I mentioned at the beginning of our discussion here. And then, of course, during the war, Korean War, even though China came in and assisted North Korea, let me back up for a second and just mention a couple of critical points during the colonial period, Japanese colonial period. There were guerrilla fighters fighting against Japanese. The Japanese had established a puppet state, Manchukuo, in northeastern China. It was run by Japanese military. So there had been resistance fighters in China, both from the nationalist side and from the communist side. And there were Koreans who had been driven out of the Korean peninsula. Any of the resistance had been driven out because the Japanese counterinsurgency operations were quite effective. So many of these Korean fighters went to China and joined up with these groups, either these communist-led groups or nationalist-led groups, to resist Japan's imperialist conquests in East Asia. So at the end of World War II, these fighters returned. So there were different factions of Koreans, those that had fought with the Chinese and had close Chinese ties, this Yan'an faction. And then Kim Il-sung, he fled to the Soviet Union, and he was in the Russian Far East. And when he returned to North Korea in September 1945, he'd actually been part of a Soviet Special Red Army unit. And the idea, the plan was that the war would go on for a considerable amount of time. That was also the plans with the U.S., but the atomic bombings changed that, and the Japanese empire collapsed rapidly. So these, Chinese, pro-Chinese faction, Koreans came to the north, and then the smaller kind of Soviet-led faction, and then there was a domestic group of these Korean nationalists who had stayed in North Korea. But this rivalry between Kim and the pro-Chinese faction in North Korea was very intense, and that posed a threat to him. So during the war, he purged all of these pro-Chinese faction and continued that during the early 50s, and then turned on the Soviet faction. There was also an incident in the 1930s, a big purge of pro-spies. There was a lot of hysteria in the communist movement in China, similar to Stalin's Soviet Union. And a lot of Kim Il-sung's comrades had been killed or executed, having been accused of being Japanese spies or pro-Japanese spies in the 1930s. So there's this memory of the Chinese being suspicious. So there's this lack of trust between them, more than the lack of trust between any two dictators, because they don't share common principles. So that history goes way back with the North Koreans and with the PRC. They dislike the Chinese. I think they dislike the Chinese more than they dislike the Americans. They're afraid of the Chinese, and they resent the fact that they're so dependent upon the Chinese for their economy. So they wish to diversify their economic dependence on China. It seems paradoxical, but North Korea wants to kind of normalize its relationship with the world, but it wants the world to be different. This kind of multipolar, new world order, which they can use the kind of jargon like the Russians do and the Chinese do. But as far as any kind of firm ideas or plans or how that world is supposed to work, they're not really clear about it. I mean, I've asked North Koreans about that over the years. I said, okay, if we dismantle the current security architecture and the current system, and the Americans get out of East Asia and all of that, what should the new order look like? What should the security architecture look like? You can have whatever you want. Explain to me what the structure would look like. And then they're kind of dumbfounded. They don't have an answer. So they're united in this, opposition to the West. When Kim Jong-un met Putin in Vladivostok in the Russian Far East late last year, he mentioned that he would always stand on the side of anti-imperialism. So Putin might not use the same words, but it's, targeted at the EU, NATO, the West, any of these institutions that constrain their behavior, whether it's in human rights, corruption, money laundering, land grabs in the security realm or what have you. They want to overturn the order so that they're not constrained by the current system.
Well, as we conclude our discussion, I'm going to give you a chance to be the advisor to the president-elect on U.S. policy toward North Korea. And what would you advise him as he begins his next term?
I would say that one of the greatest strengths of the U.S. is our system of alliances and coalition partners. Our alliance partners support us, and it's one reason that Russia, China, North Korea in particular are very opposed to them. They try to undermine those alliance relationships, try to make them fracture. So there's a lot of concern about that in South Korea. Some people in the new administration, as far as my understanding is, view our alliance relationships as not an advantage, or that they are burdensome and costly to the U.S. and do not serve U.S. national interests. But containing aggressive or potentially aggressive actors like North Korea, Russia, China is very important. The international system is such that the U.S. cannot achieve all of those goals or objectives alone or unilaterally. So it's time to bolster our system of alliances and partnerships. South Korea is a good alliance partner. that can support us across a number of areas in multi-domain warfare, humanitarian assistance, climate change, and other international challenges. And in particular, in this case, if you want to focus on the Korean Peninsula, containing and deterring North Korea. So North Korea is not irrational. The Kim regime is hyper-rational. These guys have survived decades and 3.5 decades after the end of the Cold War, if you want to call it the first Cold War, despite their weakness. So we should not antagonize or provoke North Korea. They understand strength, so standing strong with our South Korean alliance partners and other multinational alliance partners, both in Europe and Japan, to confront this nefarious, insidious attack against the global world order is important. And we should not enable or allow North Korea to engage in any belligerent activity. And we should maintain the posture, the capabilities. We should maintain the training and orientation to ensure that North Korea understands that any potential gain they believe they could achieve from aggression would be nullified by our retaliatory response or the punishment that we can impose on them, and that aggression would not pay. So we have to ensure that deterrence and containment posture is maintained pending political change in North Korea. It's an inefficient and ineffective system, and I don't think it will last forever. So until that time of change comes, we should maintain our orientation of deterrence and containment.
Sound advice, Dr. Pinkston, and I want to thank you again for joining us today on Speaking Globally.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
My guest today has been Dr. Daniel Pinkston, Lecturer of International Relations at Troy University. Our podcast is recorded in the studios of Troy Public Radio on the Troy University campus and is produced and edited by Austin Toy with help from Kyle Gassett. I'm Walter Gavan, and I look forward to talking with you again soon on Speaking Globally.